Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Postkahanism podcast. I have a guest with me today, Professor Richard Spence, who whose work I've been following for several years. You guys should all get his books, I think, and I think this interview will kind of make the case for me. So I won't tell you why. Rick, could you please introduce yourself? Tell the audience a little bit
Hi.
about you.
Okay. My name is Richard, aka Rick, so I go by Spence. I'm a professor emeritus of history at the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho, USA. Emeritus, for anybody who doesn't know, that means I'm retired. I'm a retired professor of history. I've been retired for about 4 years, staying busy with things like this and a variety of other projects. So I may be busier now than I was when I was actually working. So I was involved in American university education for about 40 years, mostly at the University of Idaho, but also at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I got my MA and my PhD, my union card into academia, and also briefly at a couple of other institutions as well. And my specialties in that, well, the main academic specialty, the thing that I was, theoretically trained in for the most part, was in modern Russian and Eastern European history. But I developed a lot of interests. I mean, there's a lot in modern European and Eastern European and Russian history. But through that, I was introduced to such things as espionage, to some degree, economic history, and then to occultism. And then all of those things in some way began to blend together. Sometimes people ask me how I got interested in the things and people I'm interested in. And my basic answer is to that is that, well, one thing leads you to another. You're not really expecting it. But you find out that these people who are all involved in one thing are also all or mostly involved in something else, and so on and so on. So it's an ever expanding realm of interests. I've written, a number of things in that career. My books, the one that you'll never be able to find because it's long out of print is Boris Savinkov, Renegade on the Left, about what is now an obscure Russian revolutionary figure who was kind of a big deal back in 1917 and the years before. What interested me about him? Why he stopped being a big deal, why nobody talked about it today. You have to read that book if you can find out to figure out why. My other books are Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, about a guy who's supposed to be a spy, but was a lot of other things. And then Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British intelligence and the occult, by far the most widely known thing that I've ever written. For some reason, I've sort of become the Aleister Crowley guy. I didn't set out to do that, but that book sort of brought me into that territory. And then most recently, just to show how I can go from one thing to another, from Aleister Crowley to Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, looked at things from 1905 to 1925, and mostly a lot of, conspiracy and skullduggery involving American economic interests and the Soviets and others. And then I've written, I have to say a lot of articles, not as many as some people, but from intelligence and national security, Russian Review, for American communist history. You don't have to be a communist, you're just writing about them. And I've also done, particularly since I've retired, some video programs. So any of you who might be subscribers to The Great Courses, also known as Wondrium, I am the creator and presenter of the Real History of Secret Societies, Crimes of the Century, and Secrets of the Occult. I'm working on another series. It'll be out in a year or so on historical villains. So there you go. That's a quick and dirty introduction to me.
Very cool. I actually came across your work originally when I read Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. I think I probably came across it while looking at Professor Anthony Sutton's work. Right, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, I believe is his title. Right?
Yes, yeah.
And he wrote a series of books about well, first he was at the Hoover Institution, right? And then he
For a while, yeah.
focusing on economic history, industrial history. And then he started writing about how the Soviet industrial complex had been built by Wall Street. And then he wrote another one about how the Nazi industrial complex had been rebuilt by Wall Street, more or less, or, and your book kind of takes the history of collaboration between the Russian communists or their predecessors from 1905 onwards, although I think really from the late 20th century, late 19th century onwards, right? And please go ahead. You're about to say.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, it basically starts off by looking at there are a variety of Americans, wealthy men, industrialists. Charles Crane is one of the key figures in this. And Charles Crane fancied himself a Russianist. He took a great interest in the people in the country because it was kind of his hobby. I don't know. It's one of the things that I found that wealthy people do, when they have all the money that they need and they no longer actually have to work or show up at the office, they begin to develop often political interests. Look at Bill Gates and the stuff that he's into that he would never be into if he didn't have more money than God and could just simply do whatever he pleased with these things. And so Charles Crane was one example of wealthy, influential Americans who took a particular interest in Russian affairs and who were basically in favor of a revolutionary change in the country. Not Lenin, not the Bolsheviks necessarily, but they basically saw the Tsarist regime, fairly or unfairly, as being backward and bad for business. And that a more, modern with it regime, something that was more, let's say, closer to the standards of American politics and economic interests would be easier to do business with. And I think that becomes one of the key factors in this. There were people in Wall Street as part of the American economic establishment who by no means were Marxists. They certainly didn't want unions in their factories, but on the other hand, they could do business with Marxists if there was money. It's as simple as that. I mean, there's no great mystery in this. Why do capitalists do business? To make capital, to make money, and if there is a potential profit in it, they'll do that. But they're also, Crane wasn't just interested in money. He also believed that he was, going to be a great, a kind of maker, and in some ways breaker of nations. He was going to be an important person in national and world affairs, and with the money he had, set out to do so. But there were a lot of others. I mean, one of the other things you come across is that, interestingly enough, there are a lot of Marxist capitalists. That is, there are people who are professed socialists who are in business. And oddly enough, they're generally pretty good businessmen. They do quite well at that. But either because they feel somewhat guilty about what they're doing or have conflicts of interest, they're also perfectly willing to slip a certain amount of money to political causes that they espouse. But the basic question that people will come up with is that why on earth would American capitalists of industry have anything to do with the Bolsheviks? Because they thought they could make money off of it, and some of them did. So what I did there is that I wasn't trying to rip off Anthony Sutton, who in the 1970s and thereafter wrote some very interesting books. To me, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And notice I was called mine Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, one, not just to repeat the title, but also because I was looking at a kind of broader picture here in a longer period of time. Then I think his other two were Wall Street and the Rise of FDR and Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. And Sutton was really delving into a kind of counter history, a counter narrative of history. One of these things that says that, a lot of the stuff that you've learned, a lot of the stuff that you've been told, well, that's not true. There's another story, and it's quite different. And it's a story which has either been forgotten or it has been deliberately obscured by this other narrative. And at the time that he did that, at the time that he wrote his Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, he had relatively little in the way of sources to go on. Russian and Soviet archives were completely off limits. He worked for a time, as you mentioned, in the Hoover Institution archives at Stanford University, and that in the West was then one of the great repositories of Russian revolutionary historical works that had been gathered there. But it was limited in many ways. It's a private institution. It's not a public institution. And one of the things that he found, or certainly felt that he had found, is that once he began to go against the general narrative that the institution was committed to, he became increasingly persona non grata and was eventually just kicked out because he was delving into things that they were not particularly interested into. And I would have to say, in all fairness, that I've done a lot of work over the years at the Hoover Institution. I always found people there to be very cooperative and helpful, but there was always an underlying political agenda. And that was set up by the guy who founded the place, Herbert Hoover. He had a particular political view, and the whole institution was created to support that particular view. Nonetheless, the materials there were for anybody to access and make out of them what they wanted to. So Anthony Sutton really, I think, sort of broke the seal on this. But I remember when I first encountered his book and I read it, it was very different than anything else I had read at the time. And I didn't know quite what to make out of it. You know, the thing you figure is that, well, either this guy is really onto something or he's crazy. I mean, he's completely off base. And probably years passed before I began to realize, particularly when I was working on the Savinkov biography, and I was sort of trying to, dig up a lot of the detritus, a lot of the stuff in the dustbin of history, they call it, the things that had been cast out of it. And I realized that, just as there was a completely different narrative or a story about Savinkov that had largely been erased, that was true for many other things. And that I would keep coming across these things that reminded me of what Sutton had been talking about. So what I wanted to do was to go back and, given the larger amount of material that we have now, and that includes everything from, well, at that time, relatively open Russian archives, much more material available in the West, and even things like digitized newspapers. I cannot tell you what a boon to my research, the mere fact that I can now, instead of going in and taking microfilms of newspapers, so first of all, hoping the newspaper has been microfilmed, and then getting a hold of those microfilms and spending way too much of my life and destroying my eyesight by looking through this page by page, I could find digitized newspaper collections spanning decades, and I could search it for a particular name and turn that up. It's amazing the kind of stuff that you can find. So that was what I wanted to do there. I think it's maybe one of the things to go back to, not to get too philosophical about it, is to, my philosophy of history. How pretentious does that sound? All right, or my basic view as to how this works. And what a lot of people believe, very common belief, you get it in school pretty much, is that everything that ever happened in the human past to everybody, at least any important people, is all written down somewhere. I don't know, in the Bibliothèque Nationale, somewhere there's a gigantic collection of huge leather-bound volumes that are a kind of super Encyclopedia Britannica that tell you everything that happened. That is, everything that happened, the important stuff, has been recorded in meticulous, accurate detail. Nothing like that. It's the furthest from the truth that you could possibly get. And really, most of what we have about history, and it gets vaguer the further back you go. Every century you go back, there's less and less material. And eventually what you're dealing with are scraps and bits of information, incomplete manuscripts, one person's testimony about what happened to many other people, and then it becomes a contest, or the kind of issue of what historians actually do is to try to figure out, well, what do these things mean? What's the significance of this particular piece of information? So there are then judgment calls that are made that this particular author, this particular source is very important, and we should pay attention to what they say. And this other source over here, well, not so important or not important at all, and therefore we shouldn't pay any attention to what it is that they say. And I think some of those judgments are perfectly correct, but they're just that. They are opinions. So what passes for history, anywhere really, about anything, is a set of relatively few facts. And facts are those things about which there can be no real debate. You know, this thing happened, this person was alive, this is what we really know, not what we believe, that's something else entirely, but what we know. So I don't know, let me take a simple example of that. We can agree that it is a fact that the Second World War happened. But that there was a Second World War, it happened. Yeah. But then you can begin to get into the details. Like, well, when exactly did it start? Well, it all depends on where you were. If you were in China, it started in 1937. Europe, it was 1939. For the Soviets, it was 1941. So there were different time periods, but it sort of fit into a different time period. But the real question here's the tricky question: why? Why did it happen? Well, that's where there are no facts. There are opinions. You can put together the different memoirs, the different ideas that people had at the time. You can line up the facts that you know. And then what historians do is that they build a narrative around those facts. And a narrative is a kind of fancy word for story. You create a story that encompasses those facts, appears to make sense out of them, and puts them into a matrix of interpretation and opinion that tells you what's important and what isn't. But one of the troubling things you can often find, and it's not that hard to do if you look at history, is you can take the same number of limited facts and you can embed them in completely different narratives. That is, you can take the same sequence of events and you can attribute different causes to them and greater importance to this one over another one. So the same set of facts can be included in stories that are completely contradictory. So that then raises the question, which one's true? What is historical truth? Well, we don't know everything. In fact, we know relatively little, and then we make up the rest. So there you go. That's what history is. It's one of those things that's created, and that's why it can change depending upon a new fact can change all of this, because it now suddenly means that you have to incorporate it into the narrative in some way, or you ignore it, and that becomes part of this whole process. Because particularly if you go into writing the history of something with a preconceived idea of what the story ought to be, in other words, if you've already figured out the ending before you've written the beginning, then everything else is going to conform to that. So to me, history is one of those things that is not, it's not in some huge set of books. It's not carved in stone. It is one of those things that is always evolving and changing and mutating, and about which relatively little can be absolutely certain. And so we believe things without knowing them.
So to that point, there were two competing narratives, I think, about the Bolshevik Revolution, one in the West and one in the late Soviet Union that I encountered. The Western one said something like, listen, there were a bunch of revolutionaries, commies or whatever, and they formed conspiracies, took over the Soviet Union. Then we had some sort of marriage of convenience during World War II, and then we went back to fighting, et cetera, and so forth. And then the Soviet narrative, I guess you could summarize about the relationship with Lenin's saying that the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. meaning these guys were just a bunch of dupes, and they didn't understand that, once we got done building communism in Chelyabinsk or whatever, next thing you know, we were going to land on the eastern seaboard and march across to Oregon or something to that effect, or subvert them and have, the red flag flying over the White House, blah, 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 blah. And then a third narrative that I encountered through Professor Sutton's works and yours is something along the lines of the Russian revolutionary movement, more broadly than just the Bolsheviks, who came along, became prominent relatively late, for decades was sort of were the clients of an American oligarchy, which were their patrons, who lent them not just financial support, but more importantly, moral support, legitimation, and so on. And you mentioned Crane. There was also Jacob Schiff. There was a whole group of people who you could describe as oligarchs, who viewed their mission as civilizing Russia or modernizing Russia. And not just Russia. When you look at, you had parallel processes going on in China, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, well, all throughout the 19th century, and in pretty much everywhere that you could point to a regime and say that's a reactionary regime. They have something that doesn't look like whatever modern democracy is at that point. The interesting thing about World War I for me is that you had an alliance of British monarchy and Russian monarchy against Prussian monarchy and Turkish monarchy and so on and so forth, with the American democracy kind of in the background. But really, I think if you would ask the people who mattered in America and Britain, they would say something along the lines of, well, the Kaiser, of course, is very bad, reactionary, and so on. And the Russian nobility, the Russian leadership is not much better or any better. And I think, to some degree, it looks like a more modern form of statehood and government cannibalizing older forms that are more vestigial, without a huge necessarily moral component to it, more like, the dinosaurs being overtaken by mammals, more dynamic, more capable of mobilizing resources, less inefficiencies, less personal, perhaps.
Yeah, it's the idea of progress. So yes. if you go back to this period, we go, if we're looking at 1905 to 1925, and you're looking at the United States, you're looking at this era which is called the Progressive Period. And it's a period, it's often sort of personalized by the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. He wasn't there that long, but he sort of epitomized this, that the idea of this was when America was sort of beginning to turn itself into a world power, having not really been one previously. Spoiling for a fight. That was one way. That was the one. See, that's the way you establish yourself as a world power. The way you establish yourself as a world power is you have to beat up one of the old ones. And that began for the U.S. in 1898, when, in essence, they picked a war with Spain. Now, Spain was, I would say, in 1898, a fourth-rate European power. Nobody in Europe was afraid of Spain. I mean, they hadn't been anything since the 16th century. But for the U.S., this was very important because it was a brief, victorious war with a minor, but nonetheless European colonial power. And as a result of that war, basically, the United States simply took over Spain's colonial empire. It took Puerto Rico, took Cuba, sort of pretended to make Cuba an independent country, but didn't. And then took control of the Philippines. So it simply took the Spanish colonial empire into their hands without ever, on the other hand, trying to admit that it was a colonial empire. And this has been one of the, I think it's almost, this is probably put it too strongly, a kind of original sin in American policy and the development of the U.S. in the 20th century, is that the U.S. became a colonial empire while always denying that it was a colonial empire. And that was because there was this concept of manifest destiny, which in the simplest terms meant that it was supposed to expand to the Pacific Ocean and dominate most of North America, which it did. It didn't manage to conquer Canada, but it managed to render Canada essentially irrelevant in that way. But also the concept of the U.S. is in literally it saw itself as a kind of New Jerusalem, as the city on the hill, as the beacon going forward. I mean, the American upper class in the early 20th century really thought a lot of themselves. And they were convinced, even though the U.S. had never up to that point shown any particular role in world affairs. And by the way, Europeans were not impressed by the U.S. defeating Spain. All right. I mean, Belgium might have been able to defeat Spain, but nevertheless, that wasn't something that made a huge impact on them. But it made a huge impact on the American consciousness, and that's why when World War I rolled along, and there eventually was the chance and sort of excuse created to join the war against Germany and its allies, the American progressive establishment jumped on that. And they didn't really jump on it, I'd argue, because there was any long-standing hostility with Germany. There wasn't any. The U.S. had no beef with Germany. They had no real... there had been some little, issues over Samoa, but that was about it. The U.S. and Germany had no fundamental conflicts. There was no strong legacy of anti-German opinion in the U.S. The U.S. was full of millions of German immigrants. They were at that point, one of the second biggest ethnic groups in the whole country. But the thing to notice is just how quickly, in 1917, when the U.S. entered the war, I mean, then the Kaiser becomes the ultimate villain. Germany is the worst country in the world, and we have to somehow rein all of this in.
Well, that's bloodthirsty Huns.
Bloodthirsty Huns, the bloodthirsty Huns, and they bought into that. But it was, one needed an excuse. One needed, above all, a moral imperative to enter the war. And the way that you do that is you cast your opponent as being, simply put, evil. So the Germans, who suddenly, the day before you had no problem with, now they're an evil threat to democracy and peace in the world, and have to be disarmed and, I don't know, forced into some sort of modern point of view. So there is you can call that hypocrisy, you can call a number of other things about it, but it was the Americans, I think, in particular. I mean, it's not that the British and the French and the Germans, the Russians, everybody else couldn't, create their own kind of excuses as well. But the Americans were very much caught up in this period in the idea of progress. And they saw themselves as the sort of world's example of progress, and that it was almost inevitable. It was a kind of process of evolution. It was the natural destiny of all nations in some form to eventually follow in America's footsteps, to become more and more American. That's how you were supposed to be modern in some sense. And it was, I think there were Americans like Crane and others who were fascinated with Russia in that sense, because it was a country which had tremendous potential. Still does. But I mean, if you look in the early 20th century, the Russian Empire was 1/6 the world's land area, had a large population. I mean, not huge for the land area, but it had a limitless, or as limitless as the world has, a limitless supply or near limitless supply of virtually all natural resources, most of which were completely untapped. So the Russians at this point had barely begun to tap their oil reserves. The part is that most of this was locked up in a vast Siberian hinterland that there was no ready means to access. But if that was ever developed, if Russia could modernize and develop if it could efficiently exploit all of the resources at its command, it would be unquestionably the most powerful country on earth. It would have more of everything as compared to anyone else. Particularly if you compared it to countries like Britain or Germany, which are really resource-poor countries. I mean, what do they got? Sand, coal, some iron reserves, but nothing of that kind. there's there are no huge repositories of natural wealth. That's why the British had to go out and essentially conquer a quarter of the world's land area to get access to all of these resources. The Russians have it within their own territory. And the U.S. many people in the U.S. could kind of see a fundamental kinship that is many ways, well, culturally, Russia and the United States were very different. They shared something in common. First of all, they were both continental powers. So the U.S. stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. It spanned an entire continent. It was big, certainly much larger than other countries in Europe. Russia was bigger still, several times over, but again, stretched all the way roughly from near the Atlantic, at least to the Baltic, all the way to the Pacific and Arctic Oceans in the north. So they were continental powers, and they faced continental questions. So a huge achievement, for instance, in 19th century America was the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, because that symbolically and literally tied the east and west of the country together. And somewhat later, 20 years down the line, 20, 30 years down the line, the Russians, of course, it was the Trans-Siberian Railroad, a railroad that would link the eastern and western portions of the empire. It's interesting that a number of engineers, of railway engineers that were hired by the Russian government to construct the Trans-Siberian were Americans. Why? Because they had practical experience in building a transcontinental railroad, of building railroads across huge windswept plains, across mountains, across deserts, all of these areas that they would find elsewhere. No other Europeans, nobody else had really had that kind of practical experience. So it was kind of surprising when I looked into it as to how many Americans in the early 20th century were in Russia doing business. And they were doing business, again, as engineers, specialists. Herbert Hoover, future American president, founder of the Hoover Institute, got part of his start. He's essentially a mining engineer. And at one point, he's hired to manage Russian mines in the Urals because he knows how to do that. And it was, I think the other thing that you could find that one of the reasons why why Russians sort of in many ways favored Americans if they were looking for foreign engineers is that in that period, before the U.S. had become a great power, Americans were viewed in non-European parts of the world, I think, as people who were basically like Europeans. I mean, they kind of look like them. They speak some of the same languages. They're modern like Europeans. They're savvy with machines, but they're not. Okay, so they're not Germans or English or French or Italians or even Russians, and therefore they don't bring along all those imperial ambitions. Because you know how it works. The Germans show up in your country, and they start making investments, and there are lots of engineers and German advisors. Well, what's gradually happening is that their political influence is going to come. You're going to turn around one day, and you're going to be a protectorate or a colony. Whereas the Americans seem to have all of the technical advantages of Europeans without being Europeans. Now, that changed after a period of time, but that's one of the reasons why they could be sort of welcome in places that others wouldn't be.
I would argue, or at least what I see, is that what happened with the American empire is that there was a private empire first, and then the public sector caught up later. Meaning that over the 19th century, the U.S. built up at the same time trade networks and political influence networks all over the world, where on one hand, you had American commercial interests being developed in places like China, Russia, Latin America, and so on. And at the same time, you had missionaries. And when you look at, for instance, in the Middle East, you look at the Arabists, who were the State Department and military and intelligence experts in the Middle East. Almost invariably, they came from families that had been here as missionaries for generations, or that had come here, come back and forth. For instance, I wrote an article about a guy named Wright, Edwin Wright, who was one of the founding fathers of the State Department's Arabism complex, I guess you'd say. And he came from he was sort of a prototype of this. He came from a missionary family that had been here. He'd spent, he got into the government game very late, but he'd been here for decades in a private capacity, in an academic capacity, and so on. So in some sense, yes, America got into the imperial game in the Spanish-American War, but actually Americans had been, trading en masse in these areas and missionizing en masse and being cultural influencers and so on. And the government just kind of caught up to that. The infrastructure was there. All you needed to do was deploy the military to beat up the Spanish, army and navy, which how hard was that, right? Said Belgium could have done it. I know Belgium could have done it because the Dutch had done it, a couple of centuries before. Yes. And I wanted to ask you, along these lines, when you read the history of the U.S. Special Forces and the CIA, you get told something like, listen, all this stuff came out of the OSS, which was built basically from scratch at the beginning of World War II, because the U.S. said, oh, gosh, we need an intelligence agency. And then there's always a couple of sentences in there, the guy that stood it up, Wild Bill Donovan, he'd been a Wall Street lawyer. And in fact, there have been some Wall Street intelligence, private intelligence services, which you kind of go, oh, there was probably, a handful of guys here and there. But it seems like the U.S. Wall Street private intelligence was actually much more of a developed thing, and had been for decades in terms of both intelligence gathering and also influence operations. From the 19th century onwards, if you look at what happened in Hawaii, for instance, you can see that fairly clearly. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think I'll say, make it simple. You're right. You're absolutely right, in my opinion. There is the private. If you look at, let's go back to the 1850s. One of the American role in the opening of Japan. So, the Japanese had spent 250 years trying to pretend it was the Middle Ages and ignoring the rest of the world. And, one of these days, somebody was going to come along with cannon, and they were going to have to respond to that. And eventually, oddly enough, it was the Americans who'd do it. But it's always sort of presented that, well, we weren't going there and threatening or anything. It was just, what did we want to do? Why were the warships sent there? Because American businessmen wanted to trade with Japan, and the Japanese wouldn't trade. And therefore, couldn't the government is supporting, its captains of industry, couldn't you assist us in convincing this country to open itself up? Because all kinds of wonderful things are going to flow to them. I mean, 100 years from now, they'll have anime, but whatever, they'll get all of this stuff. But they need some cannons to convince them of that, and sure enough, that's what. But again, it was to open in the same way, open China to the extent that the U.S. became involved in China. Why eventually it had gunboats in the Yangtze along with everyone else was to protect American commercial interests and American missionaries, as you noted. And I think one of the things I think is underestimated in particular, not just American missionaries, but especially them, is that their role as agents of influence, as on the ground intelligence sources. Missionaries go to a lot of out of the way places, and they talk to a lot of people, and they see things. And therefore, they're very good sources of what the conditions in a particular country might be. Now, for instance, if I'm a businessman and I'm thinking about investing in a country, I might want to talk to missionaries who'd come back from that country who could give me an idea about what things are like there. I mean, what do these people really think? What's the kind of class structure? Who has the money? What can I buy and sell profitably within that domain? And yes, American industry, all industries, one of the first examples, well, it's not one of the first, but a good example early on of a company which was both a business firm, but also an intelligence firm, was Lloyd's of London. the world's largest maritime insurer. And Lloyd's of London, by the 19th century, had also developed as part of it the Maritime Intelligence Service. And, Lloyd's were insurers of shipping and cargo. And therefore, it was very important to them to know the conditions, the relative degree of unrest or of calm that existed in a particular country, because ships that you're having insured might be sent into a dangerous situation. It would be good to know that ahead of time. So this company, on its own, for purposes of business, developed a worldwide intelligence service. And then they just shared that with the Royal Navy, because that was kind of expected. And why would that be the case? Because, what you'd find out very often is that the guys who were the masters of Lloyd's went to the same schools as the Lords of the Admiralty and other people within the government. Pretty much everyone in the British elite then and elsewhere were channeled through either Oxbridge. You went through that. That was the finishing school for the elite, and it was a fairly small group. You didn't necessarily like these people, but you knew them. They were part of your social class, and they shared information back and forth. If you're looking again, I come back to the figure of Charles Crane, American industrialist who then began to think of himself as a kind of international political agent of modernization and progress and whatever pleased him. And in the period, particularly around the First World War, Crane occupies a position as really an American diplomatic agent without actually being a diplomatic agent. And remember, he not only involves himself in Russian affairs, he'll involve himself in Middle Eastern affairs, because he'll be part of the King Crane Commission, which will then go in after World War I and look at what? Well, what should be done with all of these mandates? Okay, what should be the view towards things like the Palestine Mandate, the French mandates? Crane, by the way, did not like them. Okay, he thought this was simply a way in which the British and the French were dividing up the Turkish Empire among themselves, and that they didn't have the locals' best interests in mind. They are also going to, keep American business out of that area as well. But Crane is continuously, from 1905 on, one of his sons becomes, the Undersecretary of State. He can just walk in there anytime he wants to. His son, during World War I and elsewhere, lets him see confidential diplomatic cables. So Charles Crane is an American businessman, very interested in world affairs, who essentially functions without any actual appointment as an American diplomatic agent in the Balkans, in Russia, and later on in the Middle East. And his opinion matters. People in Washington listen to Crane. So there's not a hard and fast, there isn't the Wall Street clique and the Washington clique. Those are slightly different things, but they are all, to a large degree, the same group of people. They know each other. They go to the same schools. They talk to each other, and they listen to each other's opinions.
On the map, there's a line. Here's the private sector. Here's the public sector. These guys have official positions. These guys have money or whatever. But then, as you say, when you look at it socially and when you look at it in terms of personalities involved, that line just doesn't really exist. There's something I want to discuss, which is kind of related to this. You've mentioned this is kind of one linkage by which the American upper class or oligarchy or Wall Street, however you want to refer to them, how their ideas, interests, and preferences translated into policy. There's another one that you see right around this period, more, let's say, more influential internally, perhaps, which is the great foundations. Carnegie, Ford, and so on and so forth, which is to say that, right down to the present day with Gates, an oligarch takes some money and says, I want to make a foundation out of this. This will be tax exempt and it'll have people's best interests in heart and so on. And they drive social change. And they do this so thoroughly and successfully that by the 1950s, Congress starts worrying about it, perhaps in the 1930s, and there's a commission called the Reese Commission, whose chief investigator, a guy named Norman Dodd, uh, you can see interviews with him on YouTube where he says, I sent people down to the Carnegie Foundation and they went through their archives and they're looking at meetings these guys were having back in 1912 saying, what's the best way to institute sweeping and permanent social change in the U.S.? We need to get involved in some sort of global conflict and use that as a pretext, and whether that's true or not, he doesn't strike me as either a schizophrenic or a compulsive liar. You can, in fact, see that World War I, but more especially World War II, were used sort of as pretext for lasting and overarching social change in the U.S., meaning this war was so terrible, we cannot allow another one of these to happen, and therefore we need to insert a long list of policies which, maybe originally are temporary, then they become permanent. And when you're looking at these foundations, it's very interesting because from one perspective, they're driving leftist policy or progressive policy. As you use the word progressive, eventually, of course, it just became a synonym for communist. If somebody tells you that in the 50s and 60s they were progressives, they were, whether they were card-carrying communists or not is kind of up in the air. They could very well be. So on one hand, you can say they're driving progressive policies. On the other hand, you can say they're driving sort of capitalist policies, oligarchical policies. Is it one? Is it the other? Both? Neither? That's one question I want to ask you. And then the other one I want to ask you is, I've encountered the viewpoint that these great foundations and also things that sort of parallel and perhaps CFR, WF, that originally they were created by oligarchs, but they took on a life of their own and they're sort of they're adrift now. They're on autopilot. They're doing kind of a random walk or whatever. So that's kind of two questions that I have that are big. I'll let you speak to them, please.
Well, yeah, the foundations, the big three, there are others, and if you go back to the early part of the last century, you've got Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford. The Carnegie, the Rockefeller, and the Ford foundations, and others followed that. But they had at their disposal an almost unlimited amount of money. But if you look at the guys who set them up, John D. Rockefeller certainly was, as arch of capitalists as you can come across with. He was the robber baron par excellence. You would not have found any sympathy for labor among him unless he could have figured out a way to make money out. Same with Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a complicated guy of many bizarre opinions in some way. So I don't think it has anything to do necessarily with the fortunes of the people who created these, but what you did is you put a huge amount of money into what we now call a think tank. And you then recruited and staffed that with people you regarded as experts. Because this is one of the things you'll tend to find, particularly in the American view of progressivism, is that it eventually comes down to the concept of aggressive social engineering. So prior to that, you could argue the view is that, societies just kind of developed on their own. They just kind of grew up like Topsy and went in different ways. If you went back, if you looked at the kind of traditional, let's say, European social and political order, throne and pulpit. You've got a monarch of some kind. You've got some sort of official state religion. You've got an aristocracy, and then beneath it, you've got a bourgeoisie, and then all the people actually doing stuff, the peasants and workers below them. But the idea there was that, you might have aggressive or sort of ambitious rulers in some kind. But the idea was that society basically just advanced on its own. It was a kind of organic thing that you really didn't bother with very much. And the difference between that and, let's say, modern, particularly, 20th century American progressivism was, no, the idea here is that you just don't let things happen. You make things happen. You consciously and aggressively mold and guide the whole development of the country. And of course, one of the means to do that is through education. And you do that by making education mandatory. Everyone has to go to school. And once everyone goes to school, you can then all teach them the same type of things. You can mold them in the whole particular way. But nothing in a society is to be left to accident or chance. It is to be guided by experts in the direction of progress. That that things will get better and better. They will continue the concept of continuous improvement. And that's an interesting thing that I always found that found its way. I think it found its way into business. That profits will always expand, things will always improve until they collapse. But the other place it was very popular was in American higher education. And universities were and are very big about developing, it's just not, we have a university here, and we offer classes, and there are professors, and people come in and they graduate and so on. No. It all has to be highly organized in some way. And the university has to have a strategic plan. We have to imagine not just what we are now, but we have to have this whole plan about what we're going to become 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. We have to be constantly thinking about that. And we have to be constantly working on trying to turn ourselves into this idea. And the idea here was the concept of continuous improvement. That it will continue, that enrollment will go up. Things will always get better. Things will always become increasingly efficient. And if you think about that, of course, it's like a perpetual motion machine. That can't exist. There is no such thing as perpetual improvement. Things will eventually reach a particular level. They will reach a saturation point. They will reach a plateau, and then they will decline. Okay, that's the way that everything works. It's the law of entropy. You can't just keep making things bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's an idea that I think that extends from this concept is that the world is manageable. We'll find the right experts. We'll go out to the universities. We'll create these universities. We'll create new legions of eggheads in every form. And then we'll put them in positions of influence, and we'll create panels and advisory groups and these foundations that will then push these policies which will revolutionize and improve society. That's the grand idea.
So this kind of finds its culmination in the New Deal, right? It starts off, you might say, with the muckrakers or something like that. The idea that we should be ruled by experts. Well, who determines if you're an expert or not? You have the credentials. You have academic credentials. You've been checked off on the list. And eventually FDR just creates massive new branches of government governing huge areas of American life out of thin air, but not really out of thin air, because he says, okay, who's going to, Curtis Yarvin brings this example, who's going to electrify the Tennessee River Valley? Oh, this guy just graduated, from Harvard. He's got a degree in economics. Make him, give him the power. And again, you kind of see this stuff being formalized on a governmental level, these guys being given titles, but they did not fall out of the coconut tree, right? As Kamala Harris says, they didn't just appear out of thin air. The context had been created in the private sector, in the academic sector beforehand, right?
Yeah, it's you had a popular idea in business was the concept of the efficiency expert. So how do you make your business more efficient? Well, you hire people who've apparently studied human behavior. That's an interesting way to do it. And, human behavior, human motivation, human interactions with machines, and you get them to come in and, they'll study your workforce and your operation as if it's a bug. right? And we'll just break it down and we'll figure out how all of these things work and how we can put it back together in a particular way. And they will show how the business can be, how your workforce can be more thoroughly motivated, also how it can be downsized because they're expensive. And how, automation is a certain, that's one of the things that would come in. Well, one of the things we'll do here is that we'll replace all of these humans with machines. That's much more efficient. It's much more humane. It leaves the question as what all these people are going to do. But, they'll find something else because the social engineering will find some other kind of purpose for them. This was, I think, the grand sort of key. But all problems were solvable if you simply put enough experts at it. I'll give you an example of this in a kind of microcosm, but the Manhattan Project, the atom bomb project, is where, the whole idea here was let's go around and collect all of the experts we can. Let's go through all of these universities and find the physicists and others who can do this, and we'll put them all together in one place and put them under a certain degree of military control and observance and just let them go at it. Because these are the guys who can figure out how to build this. This is what we want to do. Okay, all of you experts in these things, come in here and construct an atom bomb. And they did.
Yep.
And it showed that this kind of everything is just a kind of problem to be solved in some respects. And the thing you have to admit is that that's a view that can get a lot of things done. It could and it did accomplish a great many things. And I think the Manhattan Project is a good example of that. These guys accomplished what they set out to do. But then you got the other side that, so they end up creating a thermonuclear explosive device that works. And now what are you going to do with it? So ever since then, the whole world, in a sense, has been living with this kind of malignant genie in a bottle that we don't know quite what to do with. We can't get rid of it, but we're stuck with that kind of reality. So the Manhattan Project was, I think, a great example of where experts could be set to a task and could do it, but what they created out of that, I'd argue, was a monster that no one can control.
I think a good metaphor for this was what was that Disney cartoon? Mickey Mouse and Fantasia, right?
Oh, the
Sorcerer's Apprentice. Right? You had this idea that, first of all, somebody that I very much respect, he defined communism as the idea that everything should be ruled by experts. And it sounds very crazy because we all know communism is like these parades, guys, bald peasants banging their shoe on the table, and so on and so forth at the UN, right? But the underlying idea is that everything should be rationalized, everything should be run by experts according to the human intellect, which is the ultimate arbiter of all things. And as you say, that works up to a point, and then you notice that the human intellect kind of turns on itself. And the more it's succeeded in its projects, that just gives it the more destructive power in the long run. I think something maybe similar might have happened with the intelligence apparatus, the intelligence community. I read a very interesting paper last week, which connected American academia with intelligence. It said, okay, look at all these guys who are anthropologists and so on. Carlton Kuhn, I think, is the kind of the charismatic example, who during World War II got pulled into the Office of War Information, OSS, and given free rein and said, okay, you're an expert in whatever area it is. Great. Now you're going to build an intelligence apparatus there, and now you're going to build kind of sub rosa American policy there, which military policy is going to be kind of a lagging indicator reflection of. And then after the war, they didn't just disappear. Carlton Kuhn, for instance, he was a physical anthropology professor at Harvard, but he wrote a paper for the OSS saying, listen, America needs to keep going after the war and develop an invisible intelligence empire, in order to gather intelligence and influence events and so on. And this thing needs to be global. And there was kind of an ongoing cooperation between academia and intelligence, where you see anthropologists, area studies departments working very closely with, for instance, the CIA in all sorts of ways. So my question is there still a relationship between, I guess you could say, the American oligarchy and the foundations and academia in that regard as well? Because these are usually thought of as two completely different things, right? Like here we have the CIA works with area studies departments, and here you have the great foundations and they work with academia, but neither of these things really connect at all.
Well, academia is just a kind of factory for churning out people who are supposedly experts, or who have information in some way. And one of the things that you need from the standpoint of an intelligence service is everything is about information. They're information gathering. So intelligence agencies do two things. They collect information and they conceal information. Much of the information they collect then becomes classified in some way, but it all informs their operations. So a simple idea is that if you want to understand what's going on in country X, and you want to understand what are the political possibilities there. Is this a stable regime? Could it be? Could the regime be changed? Could the regime be replaced by one which might be amenable or more opposed to what it is that our particular interests would be? And we would need academic experts to give us the suitable background in this. I mean, what is the CIA is not a university in and of itself. It doesn't have a whole sort of Harvard attack. It doesn't have to be, because Harvard exists. All these universities exist. And there you can simply tap all of the expertise and knowledge which is there to help formulate what your policy be. You bring in these people who will tell you, well, this is the history of the place. This is the culture of the place. This is the economic potential of the place. These are the natural resources it has. You can then collate all of that information together. Academia is also the main recruiting ground for intelligence agencies. And where do you think you're going to find most of these people from? You're probably not going to hire them right out of high school. You're not going to go to a homeless camp and find them. You're going to go to universities. And, just as in Britain, it was Cambridge and Oxford. In the U.S., it was, and to a certain degree still is, essentially Harvard and Yale and, kind of Stanford and some of the other ones. But those were the ones that really counted. So if you wanted to be taken as an expert in Washington, having a degree from Harvard is a lot better than having a degree from North Dakota State. I mean, that's perfectly good, but it simply has the brand name. It has the association with it. It has the greater authority claim, which is attached to that. So yes, intelligence and academia are, they're joined together at the hip. They're almost inseparable. One supplies the basic tools and personnel that the other one uses. It was when I was in grad school, I always have to go back to that, in the 1970s, the University of California, Santa Barbara. I was in a thing which was called the Balkan Studies Program, or the East European Studies Program. The head of it was a Serbian emigre by the name of Dimitrij Đorđević. He was sort of a mentor, very nice guy, all the rest of it. But if you looked around within it, you found that, he was very much, let's say, typical of the post-World War II Eastern European anti-communist emigre. Okay, Tito was the curse of his family. Okay, he had no love for Tito or the communist regime. I think the Đorđević family had been like one of the 5 richest families in Serbia at one point, and that didn't quite last as it went through. So he came to the U.S. He found, I think probably his whole recruitment and his positioning at the University of California I can now see, had CIA fingerprints all over it. Okay. Not that they personally array, but this would be a useful guy to have. He has influence still within the country. He can help inform people here. And you got to keep in mind the 70s is in the middle of the Cold War. And so here's this academic program at a major state university in which young Americans are essentially being trained to be experts in the history and culture of Eastern Bloc countries, and who also are probably at some point in their career going to go there and do research, who will have legitimate reason to go there and do research. And I would ask you, do you think that an American intelligence agency could potentially have any interest in those people? Yes. Yes, they did. And it was only years later. The thing is, at the time, I don't think this crossed my consciousness, but only years later I realized that, oh, yeah, another thing there was that there were a lot of sort of retired military officers, U.S. military officers, who were there kind of like working on their masters, but never quite finished them. And there was one guy that was very, very friendly. And it was pointed out to me later as to what his role was. He was the spotter. That's what his whole goal, he was to sort of watch people and we could make certain suggestions along the way. But it was like, that somehow I never got drawn up in that, but nevertheless, the offer might have been made, but it must have gone over my head or whatever the case might have been. But it was one thing, it was doing its job of training American academics, of training American historians in the history of those areas, but it was also creating this pool of experts that was a perfect pool that could be used by the CIA or anyone else who wanted to do so. They were consumers of the product. They were major consumers of the product which was being produced there, and it was in their interest to see that was done. So yeah, that's always been there. It makes, once you begin to look at it that way, it makes perfect sense that it would be. You can see that, yes, that's absolutely what it is.
So you can see this not just in the area studies fields, although there are very interesting connections there. For instance, if you look at President Obama's mother, she made a lifelong career out of this sort of stuff in this area, right? She was a scholar, and she worked for the government, and she was in academia and back and forth and so on. But you also look at it, for instance, for biomedical research. When you look at MK Ultra, it was largely a private undertaking, or, well, I don't know, private if that's the right word, but it was largely outsourced to universities in the U.S. and Canada. The hands-on research
Institute.
Sure.
Sure. All the spooky stuff about remote viewing and time travel and all the other sort of weird stuff, you'd far, because you don't want to have government agencies doing that type of thing. And again, they don't have to. There are universities that already have people to do that. That's there was give you an example of that. There was a document I came across not long ago. It's an FBI document from 1949. And the interesting thing about that is it's basically 2 years since the CIA has been formed. It's a new agency. And it's an FBI report based on people who were there. The FBI apparently didn't actually send anybody to this meeting. Partly they weren't invited, but also J. Edgar Hoover didn't like the CIA, or it didn't trust what they were, but he wanted to know what they were up to. So it was a meeting which was actually held, this is interesting, in the private home, in the apartment of an American businessman, scientist, Alfred Loomis. He ran his own sort of private labs. He did most of his contracts were for the government. So this whole meeting is held in this guy's home. And there are representatives from the Air Force, from the military, and then 2 guys from the CIA. And they're basically there to give to give a talk. They're there to give a lecture and bring people up to date. And what they're talking about, this is in 49, is that they're talking about the potential advantages of hypnotic suggestion. What can we do if we can hypnotize people? And remember, this is 4 years or so before MK Ultra comes along. But the basic idea of it, this is what it means to me, is that it's there at the time. And so they're giving, by the way, one of the guys is part of the CIA team. People might recognize the name Cleve Baxter. And Cleve Baxter was the CIA master of the lie detector machine. Basically, everything that we know and think about lie detectors today comes from Cleve Baxter's work. He's also the guy that, as a result of his work on lie detectors, came to the conclusion that plants can feel. So if you ever had this idea that, plants respond to music and they think it's Cleve Baxter, CIA lie detector guy, you have to think for that. I don't know whether he's right or wrong, but it's interesting that those things would come together. So they're giving this presentation on the wonderful things that we could do if we could have reliable means to hypnotize people. And a couple of the things that they enumerated were, well, one of the things that we could potentially do was that we could eliminate memories from people's minds. We could selectively eliminate memories, and we could implant other ones. And it's, based upon other research I've done and I'm doing, that was a particularly sort of eerie statement, because I think that later on in much of MK Ultra, that's part of what they're trying to do. They're trying to understand the entire architecture of the human mind. They're trying to figure out how to take it apart and put it back together in ways that they want. And the concept of being able to manipulate people's memories to both create false memories and to eliminate real ones is you don't even have to imagine that they could ever do that. Just imagine for a moment when they try to do that. Imagine the amount of mischief that could be accomplished in simply seeking that goal, whether or not you actually attained it. But then the next thing to keep in mind is that, what if you attain it?
Well, Oceania has always been at war with these things, right?
Right. It's always been at war with these. It kind of, the reason why that particularly struck me is that there's a very odd character that I got interested in, because, I only get interested in normal people. Just apparently don't interest me. So I'm just basically interested in sociopaths and pathological liars. They're interesting. So this is a guy, I don't know whether his infamy is spread to Israel, but his name is James Shelby Downard, and he's sometimes counted as being one of the early examples of American conspiracy theorists. And James Shelby Downard is really just this kind of, he comes from this relatively upper, what passes for a upper middle class upbringing is born in Oklahoma, all right? And then goes on, a person of no particular education or importance, but who later on seems to become, as an adult, and certainly as a person in his 40s by that time, just a complete raving paranoid. And he thinks that, what does he think? Well, he thinks that someone has messed with his mind and that they have eliminated his real memories and implanted false ones. And therefore, he's constantly trying to figure out what his real memories are. And he's not the only one who does this, but and when is this supposedly happening? Well, in the late 40s and early 1950s. And it's I'm not saying that the guy isn't. I'm just saying that here you have these people talking about what we could potentially do in manipulating memories. And essentially contemporary to that, you have an individual who comes to the conclusion that that's exactly what was done to him. So that's interesting. And I don't know. I think that certainly James Shelby Downard, by any clinical definition would be described as a paranoid schizophrenic. But he's not so crazy, for lack of a better term, that he isn't, well, he wrote autobiographies. He wrote, it's this kind of, in its original form, it's almost this impossible rambling type of thing. It's almost this kind of stream of consciousness. It's not a normal autobiography, but he's trying to record the events of his life from childhood on. What he thinks are recovered memories. And it's wild stuff. I mean, it includes things that he has childhood recollections of doing things that really no child could rationally do. But the question about this was, for me, okay, well, how nuts is this guy? So if if we assume that he's completely out of touch with reality, then when he's talking about in this autobiography, he's talking about, I was born here, I lived here, I went to school here, my parents knew these people, I knew these people. He gives, remember, the basic facts that he's giving you. So what I did was to look for the great repository of facts, which was to go to public records. So when he says, I was born in Ardmore, Oklahoma on such and such a day, because one of the questions was whether or not Downer was even a real person. I quickly established that he was, because all the information that he gives about himself and his connections is basically accurate. So here's the interesting question for me. Here you have a person who can basically remember his life accurately, one that conforms to the general paper trail that his life left behind him. So he's not fantasizing, he's not imagining at least the great majority of the people or events in his life. Those things can be documented, he can be placed in there. And more, it comes down to the particular interpretation again about what these events mean, what kind of significance that they had. So he's taking people and real events and real people, and then somehow he's putting them together in these kind of nightmarish scenarios. But it raises the question for me is that when you talk about, when you dismiss someone as being crazy, well, first of all, what does that mean exactly? I mean, I don't want to get into psychiatry, but no one to me can ever convincingly, I've never gotten a good explanation of exactly what madness is. We don't know what causes it. It just happens to people. It comes in a variety of different forms. There's a gigantic, ever-expanding volume of all the disorders that one can have, to which we give names to in one way. But those are all just kind of variations of human experience. And so the question in Downard is that when does reality of his life completely become madness? Or are those two things inextricable in some way? And that because if I think that he's mad, if I assume that this guy is just paranoid, and I interpret everything he's saying as an example of his paranoia, then I can easily dismiss all of it. Okay, he's crazy. I don't have to pay any attention to what he says. But the point is, he's apparently only crazy part of the time. So how can I be sure that some of the seemingly really just weird stuff he's describing didn't happen? Because most of what he's describing did. It's that's certainly a tangent I've gone on to, but to me, it's one of these things is that it brings up this whole sort of nature of, when you're talking about what history is, when you're trying to define what's the narrative, what's the fact and what's the opinion, what you're really talking about is you're trying to define what reality is. And that's why one of the things I was, would tell my students in my classes, that when you're studying history, you're not just studying past events, you're studying the whole nature of reality. Because history is our attempt to make sense out of reality around us. And part of it's accurate, part of it's not, but it's one of those things you constantly have to look at and reassess and figure it out. And the thing is, the reality is that reality is tricky. Okay.
So Downer is very interesting because his story is a little bit like a Philip K. Dick novel, and
Yeah.
well, a lot like a Philip K. Dick novel. And the idea of where Philip K. Dick got his kind of meta style is, I mean, that's a wormhole I don't really want to go down into right now. I don't think it was coincidental that he emerged when he emerged in the milieu he emerged. But this kind of plays into something that I wanted to bring up. And, as sort of the final topic that I would like to discuss on this interview, the occult. So, on one hand, this seems very incongruous because you have all these people who, from the 19th century onwards, were above all, they were rationalists in some sense. Meaning, like, the idea of progressivism is that we seek to scientifically discover the truth, find the optimal courses of action, and implement them, and of course, use academia as a proxy at how good you are at those things. And at the same time, paradoxically, you have constant undertones of, occult mumbo jumbo, right? In the same social circles, and without going into wild-eyed conspiracy theories. For instance, when you read autobiographies of people who were sort of in those rarefied social circles or adjacent to them, an example, for instance, would be Gerald Darrell, who himself was a zoologist, but his family very much belonged to that late 19th century, early 20th century British elite. And he casually goes, "Oh, yeah, all these guys were into seances and spiritism and conjuring up the spirits of the dead and Ouija boards and so on and so forth." And so I never know what to make of this because it seems like such a glaring contradiction that you constantly find this stuff popping up in intelligence, in elite social circles, in academia. What's your take on it from your decades of study?
Well, like I started maybe saying is that, one of my books, my best known book, deals with Aleister Crowley, who's, for better or for worse, mostly for the worse, considered to be the arch occultist of the 20th century. And it's probably true. Almost all sort of occult threads that now exist, if you think of the occult as a sea, Aleister Crowley is the great river that flows into it. Everything's kind of connects with him. And Crowley, again, came from this late Victorian, Edwardian, not the highest echelons, but, he got his way into Cambridge. He might have gone into the diplomatic service. His family had money. He was well educated. He could have done a lot of things with his life. And what he basically decided he would do is dedicate his life to the study of the occult. Essentially, what he wanted to do was to found a new religion, a kind of entire new spiritual dispensation for the world. And so one of the questions that comes up is that, well, how would other people in the British elite, why did anybody ever pay attention to him? Why would people in British intelligence, who must have been all rational, sensible people, why would they ever have paid attention to him? And the simple answer to that is that they were all basically about 3/4 along the same route that he was. That is, what he was talking about, the concept of magic, which I'll come back to in a minute, the concept of metaphysics as a force that influenced the world, that there were powerful, unseen, but real forces that influenced people in the world around them. Things that any intelligent person, any person interested in power might want to have, that could be a portion of it. That's essentially what the study of the occult entailed. And, you're absolutely right. Within that whole class, the concept of spiritualism was widely accepted. It wasn't necessarily believed, but there were people who seriously explored it. And it's I ran across something the other day that, again, from the First World War period, There was a fellow, he's the first cousin of Winston Churchill. And he was Sir John Randolph Leslie. And he basically wrote and went under the name of Shane Leslie. And he, again, was one of these upper-class Brits who was interested in all things metaphysical. He later became known as, England's prime ghost hunter. But he was interested in a lot of what we now call paranormal phenomena, before it was called that. That's what he spent most of his spare time investigating. But among other things, one of his friends was the Royal Naval officer, I think David Beatty, the commander of the British battle cruiser squadron in the Battle of Jutland. And so one of the things that Beatty, a naval commander, man in charge of much of the Royal Navy, got from his friend Shane Leslie were all sorts of little occult tricks that he would always, that Beatty would always sort of acknowledge the moon when he was on the deck. He would bow to a full moon. He would perform these little rituals that, part of it, life aboard ship is merely a series of rituals, but he would add these to it. So the reason why Crowley tended to be accepted by much of the British establishment was because most of them at least partly believed in what he believed in. It was not an idea that was ridiculous to them. So let's go back, though, to that whole question of Crowley's concept of magic, which he, spelled with a K on the end to differentiate it from pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And I'm going to paraphrase this. I've paraphrased it enough, I should be able to get it right. But Crowley defined magic as the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. It's a kind of mind over matter type of thing. But it's a causing change, physical change in an object, change in people, change in all form, in conformity with will. Now, the thing is that what he's talking about is something that you hear all around you today. You ever hear anybody talking about manifesting something? That I have to try to manifest happiness. If you think you're going to become wealthy, you'll become. That's magic, my friends. That's all that it is. It is imagining something and imparting energy to it through will to bring it into being.
That's in some way a mirror image of the progressive idea, right? Yeah. We're rationalists, and the more that we're rationalists, the more we can impose our will on nature itself, human nature, society, and so on. The question is the hypothetical framework and the mechanism, right? You won't see progressives saying, well, there are these spiritual forces that by performing certain rituals, we can influence them to supernaturally do our will, right?
But if we could, you're right. They want the progressives imagine how the world should be, and then they set out to apply through methodology, but also through will to make it that way. That becomes part of this. You have to want to do that, and this is exactly what Crowley and the concept of and that's to a certain extent what, in a broad sense, the occult, everything connected with it, comes down to. It's an attempt to alter reality. It's an attempt to literally bend reality to your will, to influence. Maybe you're only influencing it in some tiny infinitesimal way, but over time, all of that can eventually change the course of reality. So what seemingly practical-minded progressives wanted and what occultists wanted was exactly the same thing. It was simply a matter of methods that you would have. And it raises the question is, why does the CIA, the U.S. Army, and every other intelligence agency on Earth who's had any money has always tended to investigated occult techniques, and they do it for the same reason. Because they think, or they suspect, or they hope, or they fear, or some combination of all of those, that this stuff might actually work. And you see, if we don't try that and figure it out, well, the Ruskies will. They've got somebody over there doing this type of thing. And what if it could? What if you found out that you could bend reality to your will? Who would know if you did so other than you? And so it's an idea, I think, that sort of fits seamlessly with the whole concept of what appears to be materialistic social engineering. Is that, well, if you can use, if magic would assist, then it's just another tool, isn't it? Occultist, someone like Crowley just becomes another expert whose talents that you can use in the pursuit of a more perfect world.
You could conceivably trace this back to one 19th century guy. Well, I guess his predecessors, his social circle, which is Hegel, right? Because Hegel, on one hand, is this rationalist, and on the other hand, everything is moved by a world spirit, which is kind of like maybe a parallel of the Gnostic demiurge. And therefore, the degree to which you embody its desires, the degree to which you find success, and so on and so forth. So it's still there's a big contradiction between materialism and a belief in the occult, right? Maybe you can say they're just different models to describe reality, which itself is beyond any model. But it's always been very strange to me to imagine people who, on one hand, they're moving past religion and past Christianity and so on. And on the other hand, you see them believing in things and acting in ways that would be right at home with Nigerian witch doctors, for instance.
Well, one of the things that it's an arguable conclusion, but I have come to the conclusion that one way or the other, no matter what it is that they profess, people will come up with some kind of religion. They will. Materialism itself is a form. They will put their faith in something. I mean, here again, let's go back to Soviet communism. That was a state-sponsored religion if I've ever seen one. It had holy books. It's got saints. It all the millennium will be physically manifested as opposed to spiritually manifested. It's a religion.
Instead of the doctrine of the Trinity, which is you can't understand, you just have to have to accept it. You have dialectical materialism, which also nobody can understand, but you have to accept it.
Sounds good.
Yes. And I think it was Chesterton that said that when people stop believing in God, they don't stop believing in anything, they start believing in everything. The question is, I guess this invites speculation on how much this has continued to the present day. I remember in 2016, in the lead up to the election, there was a big scandal that there appeared to be some sort of occult activity going on in Washington, that people that were highly connected to the previous administration and perhaps the Clinton campaign had been somehow involved in, et cetera, so forth. It very quickly went off the rails, arguably, into
Pizzagate. Is that what you?
Yes. Complete mumbo jumbo territory. But in the context of what we're discussing, it's believable, perhaps. There's no clear point at which you can say, okay, all these people who were connected at the highest circles of society believed in magic and the occult and rituals and so on, and then at this point it stops, like it's gone.
Well, the essence of that is that there's a huge pedophile plot, child sacrifice, right? This is what we're talking about here, really. Is that, yes, there are pedophiles who, in addition to all of their, disgusting sexual lust for children, also kill them. Well, let's examine that. Has child sacrifice ever existed in human history? Yeah, all the time. Ancient Middle East was full of it. Okay, the Greeks practiced it. The Romans, a lot of people did it, but they didn't really want to talk about it. But yes, human sacrifice is a real thing. It is an unpleasant thing, but it's real. Are there pedophiles? Yes, indeed there are. Are there organized pedophiles? Are there groups of people in the dark web or elsewhere? And do they trade things back and forth? Are they organized in a hidden underground way? Yes. So now keep in mind here, don't come out, no one come back and say that I just said that Pizzagate was real. I don't think so, but it's easy for me to figure out where the story could come from because all the basic ingredients of it, the ingredients used to create that fiction, are real. Nothing is being described in that. You may argue that none of those people were involved in it, that nothing ever happened involving pizza, heaven forbid, but all the parts of it, organized pedophilia, individual pedophilia, child sacrifice, the other elements that, yes, those things are real. There's nothing that says that that type of thing is beyond the realm of human possibility, because it's not.
Very classical book called The Golden Bough by George Fraser, which sort of traces, how would you put it? It traces sort of primitive religion across various societies, and one of the key elements is taking a sacrificial victim and worshiping him or her, and treating him or her as kind of the material representative of some grand metaphysical process, and adoring him or her, and then the sacrifice. And this, could be animal sacrifice, it could be human sacrifice, it could be one as a replacement for the other, and so on and so forth. And Fraser seems to see it as archetypical, meaning that this is just something that people tend to alight on, or they tend to do. And again, this on the face of it would seem insane, because we're not African witch doctors. We're not Pacific Islanders. We believe in science and materialism and so on. And all the more so the people who are in charge of us, who have been through decades of selection for sanity, training in academia, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, you see this stuff popping up somehow constantly. Whereas, whether it's alluded to or whether you have some explicit things coming up and so on. And I guess that would bring me back to the original topic in a way. How much would you say the American oligarchy of the early 20th century, how much did they believe in all this stuff?
Probably the same amount that you would find, since they were very closely tied culturally to their British cousins. I don't think it would be maybe even more in the U.S. And the reason I would mention that is a couple of reasons for it. One, American society, I think more than most European societies of the 19th century, was still heavily influenced. It is arguably still heavily influenced by this kind of, by waves of sort of popular religious mania. You had the Great Awakenings. You would have these, if you go back in 19th century America, it happens again in the 1920s, and you have these waves of sort of evangelical, it's mostly manifests itself in the form of evangelical Christianity, which is this very ecstatic, and also, when I look at it, also heavily occult influenced, since one of the things that tends to go hand in hand in that was this form of spirit possession, which is, all right, you get so caught up in the worship that you go into a trance, fall on the ground, start writhing around, talking in tongues or in gibberish. You were talking about witch doctors. That's it. It's voodoo. The same thing that happens and I've seen it, and the same thing that happens in a voodoo ceremony with just very minor adjustments is the same thing that can happen in a Pentecostal camp meeting. Which is mass hypnosis.
Yeah, right. That's the definition of mass hypnosis. You have some sort of mass connection to an unconscious realm. Okay.
Yeah. Well, see, we've given a name to it. We go, well, you see, that's mass. But what is that? What's the mechanism of it? I mean, what is actually going on? See, just because we can name it doesn't mean we know what it is. It's like we give names to demons, right? Every demon has a name, but doesn't mean you necessarily know what they are or even whether or not they exist. And so you've got these manifestations of it. So American society was full of this religious zeal that would expand, and it would find its way into things. And by the way, I think the sort of modern woke phenomenon, to me, the modern woke phenomenon is simply the new manifestation of American Puritanism. It's always, again, trying to improve, and purify things. And you found that the temperance movement, how many other societies on earth decided they were just going to have an entire political movement to ban alcohol? Okay, who else tried that? But in America, they did. And that to me is why prohibition was one of the great. In some ways, it was the great failure of progressivism, because this is what we're going to do. We're just going to eradicate the entire curse of alcoholism. We're going to eliminate this from society by just banning it. All right, that'll work, and then no people will drink anymore, and we'll have none of the social problems connected to alcoholism or any of the rest. But you've got this extremely strong, repetitive sort of waves of religious impulse. And the other thing to remember is that modern spiritualism basically begins in the U.S. with the Fox sisters in the 1840s. There are these three upstate New York sisters who decide that there's a ghost in the house, and they start communicating with tapping, and then they become huge sort of media stars. And that and the Civil War and the rest of it. But it's not to say that you didn't have, Allan Kardec and others sort of doing the same thing elsewhere, but they really sort of get the thing going. And then that eventually goes overseas. It's carried to Britain and elsewhere. And so for all of its, an interesting sort of thing is that for all of its connection to modernity, materialism, rationalism, and progressivism, America is simultaneously, there's this great reservoir of this kind of primitive religious mania, and is, if nothing else, the one place you can sell occult ideas here better than you can anywhere else.
Well, right, because America is connected to the world now instantaneously through electronic media. And if you think of what's participation in ritual, you can be an active participant, but most participants are passive; they're observers. And what does America excel at? Rabbi Adam Steinsaltz said that the largest religion in the world is Hollywood. America excels at delivering electronic entertainment, which psychologically may be like passively participating in a ritual. When you watch a movie, your subconscious mind doesn't necessarily understand, hey, this isn't real. This is, these are images on a screen. Right? To some part of you, you're there. So it's interesting.
I would say that, yes, you're absolutely right. Movies are rituals, and when you watch one, you're participating in the ritual.
Yes.
Because a ritual is simply a series of actions carried out in a precise manner.
Yes. Scripted.
Anything that fits that is a ritual.
And so if you wanted to affect mass change in consciousness, kind of circling back to what we discussed in the beginning, if you to achieve some sort of end goal, some kind of change in human consciousness, well, Lenin said that the most important art form to us is the movie, the cinematograph, right? That cinematography is the most important art form to us, arguably for this exact reason. But Lenin was not this genius visionary. By the time he said that, Hollywood had been in existence for decades, and worldwide as well. So this has really been a great conversation. I think we've covered lots of ground on topics that I don't really see discussed or juxtaposed too much in the public eye. Perhaps we can have a follow-on conversation to discuss how this has affected my neck of the woods specifically. Wonderful. Is there anything else that you would like to conclude with?
Well, again, we've gone over a lot of stuff, and I just kind of leave it this. I'm a retired academic. I was always maybe. I'm not sure. I never tried to be a typical academic in a way. It's one of those things that you go through the process and a large part of it is bullshit, but you do it anyway because it's expected of you.
It's ritual.
It's ritual. You go through the rituals, you bow to the appropriate gods, you perform the appropriate sacrifices. You don't necessarily believe in any of this stuff, but you have to do it. So, I would say that, one of the things I've thought about is I just turned 73, okay, which is still kind of shocking, but and it's made me think about the fact that when I was 17, I can remember thinking that I pretty much had things figured out. All right. I thought that, yeah, this must be the way that things actually work. The world seemed to actually kind of make sense. At 73, I do not have that sense of certainty at all. Okay. If anything, it has become more mysterious. It has become less predictable, more seemingly irrational, but also in a lot of ways really more fascinating and interesting than it ever was before. And I think that for me, somebody once said is that, well, it's just you just learn a lot of stuff. And well, that's not what I'm trying to do. I don't think my whole thing is just try to, collect information like, figurines and put them on a shelf somewhere. It's not just a contest to see who can know more stuff. But what's interesting to me is that when I learn things and I find something I don't know, that's when suddenly it's like I said, that one thing leads you to another. And then you realize that there's this whole other vista of stuff out there. There's a whole other layer to this that you never even knew existed before. And that to me is really what, at 73 makes learning interesting. It makes life interesting. It gives something to aspire to because the world is a mysterious place. It is an occult place. Much of everything about it is hidden. And as much as we humans think that we've learned everything, we don't know nothing really about history or much of anything else. But all of it is there potentially to be discovered.
Yes, the big falling of intellectuals and academics, I think, is that they tend to look at the map and forget that the map is not the terrain. And then when they discover it, they say, "Oh gosh, we just need a better map. Now I have a better theory of everything. I have a better model, and this model is actually the terrain." And that's sort of the great failure of rationalism. The great failures can always be traced back to that conceptual mistake, I think, which is to forget that maybe we can approach the truth asymptotically, but we cannot model it accurately ever, right? Except for in a certain very narrow envelope.
Well, it's trying to figure out what the hell the truth is.
Sure.
And I mean, it's the type of thing of where, the old saying is that if an event occurs and there are people who witness that event, but you'll never or very seldom get the exact same description from each of them. People can be at the same place at the same time. They can ostensibly see and experience the same thing, but they don't really experience it in exactly the same way. And sometimes that's because they're looking in different directions, or they're looking in slightly different directions. Or it's just because their whole manner of perception is different than another person. But you would find that there would be, maybe not significant, but there would be subtle differences in the recollections of different people at the same time and the same place. And while those may not be terribly, they may not be necessary to create a general idea of what happened, a kind of general truth, the idea is that the specific truth, the absolute truth, will always elude you. And I think the reason for that is that it never existed in the first place. The absolute truth, the single, the one, the only truth, was never seen by anybody. They all saw little parts of it. And it's not as simple as simply taking all of those little parts and putting them together, because when you would compare those people's recollections, you'd find that some completely contradict the other ones. So the pieces don't fit. There is no, this is really kind of a hokey statement to make, but the quest to determine the absolute precise, to create a perfect map, if you put it, of an event, of an historical event, or any period, is impossible, because there is never a map to begin with. It's always a certain amount of interpretation and opinion. What you like and what you don't like.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate your time with us today.
Well, I appreciate you having me on.
Hope we can do it again.
Yeah, certainly. Anytime.
Okay. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.